Now, when we talk about an assumption, remember that at the very fundamental level, an assumption is an unstated premise. When we say it's an unstated premise, what does that mean? It means that it is also a premise to start with. It is just that it is not stated in the argument. So, in other words, this is probably a missing link between the existing premises and the conclusion, which when brought into the argument, because it was missing, can ensure that there is a much more smoother logical flow to the argument as such. So, an assumption is an unstated premise. It also leads to a conclusion. Now, let's go back to understanding this mathematically with our A, B, C, D terms. So, we know that A relates to B and C relates to D. We have derived the conclusion that A relates to D from this. Now, from this, if you are able to understand and recognize that B relates to C is the missing link to help us arrive at A relates to D directly, then you understand that B relates to C is your assumption as such. Now, let's understand this with an actual critical reasoning model example as such. What you see on your screen is this. So, it says that students of a school have not been scoring well in math, particularly in year-end examinations. Hence, students are advised to download and use our new learning app to better their scores. So, the hence is your conclusion identified. This tells you that this part of your argument is your conclusion. It's an argument because it has a conclusion. And the first part automatically becomes your premise that tends to support your conclusion. Now, your question says the argument above assumes which of the following. So, what did the argument assume? So, what was your premise primarily? It was that students have been showing poorer performances in math in their year-end exams, based on which the school wants to advise students to download their learning app so that their scores will get better. Logically, this is not a strong argument, because the first and foremost, the missing link, the thought that you have to get is, how does downloading a learning app ensure that students get better scores? And is this learning app dealing with math, or is it dealing with something else as such? So, there are various questions that you can now start posing to the argument to lessen the strength of the argument. So, let's take a look at the choices. First choice says, students of the school have been scoring high in sciences, out of scope because we are concerned with math. A similar app that another school uses for its students helped its students improve their scores. A similar app in a different school may have helped students improve their scores, but still again this is not really relevant to our context, primarily for a couple of reasons. One, what may be valid with respect to the neighboring school need not necessarily also hold good with our school, number one. Number two, the students' scores in the neighboring school, did they improve in math is what we have to question. That's not mentioned, and hence how did their scores improve doesn't really help us anymore to analyze how situations can improve in our school. We eliminate B. Third choice, C. Students of the school showed outstanding performance in extracurricular activities is again irrelevant for us, because we are concerned primarily about improving performances in math. Scores of students in year-end examinations is related to using the learning app. Now, scores of students in year-end examinations is related to using the learning app. Now, compare that with choice E. Choice E says using the learning app improves math scores in year-end examinations. So, between the two, you should be able to understand that D acts more like an inference, because that is what you are deriving, while E acts more like the missing link between the two, because this now ensures that using the learning app for math improves math scores. So, your answer option would be the fifth one. Moving on to looking at another question type called as parallel reasoning. Now, when you talk about parallel reasoning, your exam will ask you to identify from the choices one option that parallels or mimics the reasoning given in the question argument. So, what do you have to do here? You first have to understand the line of reasoning in your given argument, and thereon you should be able to try spotting the exact line of reasoning from your answer options. So, that answer option that mimics the exact line of reasoning will be the one that parallels your given argument. Let's take a look at this with an example. Now, example on your screen says, it is true that smoking relates to a personal choice, but the Supreme Court should step in and ban the use of tobacco in the larger interest of the population. Now, smoking relates to a personal choice, but he says, but Supreme Court should step in and ban the use of tobacco in the larger interest of the population. So, this is the author's opinion now. Which of the following is most likely the argument above, is most like the argument above in its logical structure? So, if you look at choice A, it says that it is true that oceans are being polluted by plastic disposal. Hence, if the oceans are to be saved, plastic disposal must be made illegal. Now, the line of the reasoning in the argument talks about first some habit or some manner or methodology, something is a personal choice. In spite of that being a personal choice, now a much bigger authority should step in to completely take that personal choice away from people in the larger interest of the people. That's the argument. Choice A, we are saying that oceans are being polluted by plastic disposal. Now, this plastic disposal, you might be tempted to think that this is also a personal choice because somebody may choose to dispose of plastic in the oceans. But remember, here personal choice refers to something being impacted to a person because of the choices the person made, like smoking. But here, when somebody disposes of plastic in the oceans through a personal choice, it's not impacting the person directly, it's impacting the ocean. So, choice A will not qualify as a parallel example because this example is not similar to what is given. So, we eliminate A. Look at choice B. It is true that the government is on the road to eradicating polio. Again, personal choice, question mark. But there are still other life-threatening elements that the government must focus on, so we know this also will not parallel. Choice C. It is true that alcohol consumption is a personal choice. Yes, of course, this is similar to the given example. But neurotoxins should be banned. So now we are saying that all kinds of neurotoxins, all kinds of toxins that act on your nervous system directly should be banned, though it's people's choice to use to consume alcohol. So this is very parallel to the logic given there. So I would recommend that you go through choices D and E and see for yourself why they are not logical enough to answer the question. Now, let's take a look at another model which is known as resolving the paradox. Sometimes your questions also may ask you to explain the paradox or resolve the paradox or resolve a conflict in the argument. Now, here's how a paradox is formed. In the earlier session, when you were learning about identifiers like conclusion identifiers, premise identifiers, we also learned something called as counter premise identifiers. Now, what exactly is a counter premise identifier? Counter premise counters a premise. So, if you have a paradox in a situation, a short passage, it means that there is a premise, there is also a counter premise. So, you have two opposing, two conflicting scenarios that are coexisting in that context. Your question will be to explain how can these conflicting ideas coexist. That's how a paradox is formed. Take a look at the example on your screen. Now, most of the Indian businesses evade paying GST. However, the amount of GST paid by businesses in the last 2 quarters has shown an increase. How is this possible? When the first is a factual statement that says that most businesses do not pay GST. How is it that in the last 2 quarters GST income has increased? Which of the following resolves the discrepancy? How do you explain this? Look at choice A. Individuals pay income tax promptly. Irrelevant. We are concerned with a different kind of tax. The number of businesses claiming GST credit has increased in the last 2 quarters. We are not talking about businesses claiming credit, but businesses crediting GST into the government's account. A greater number of businesses registered themselves as GST payees. Those with above 20 lakhs per annum revenue, merely registering will not qualify them to have paid because we do not know if they have paid or not. D. Businesses fudge accounting to show overall lower revenues over 4 quarters when compared to 2 quarters. Yes, this will resolve the discrepancy because people tend to fudge accounts over 1 year period as opposed to showing GST paying in 2 quarters.